The mountain man expected a bride, but the widow with children who arrived changed his life forever. He lived high in the Bitterroot Mountains, alone for 15 years, waiting for a woman who never came. When he finally opened his door again, it wasn't a young, childless bride who stepped off the wagon. It was a weary widow with two small boys, eyes full of sorrow, and nowhere else to go. Folks in town whispered he'd send her packing, but they didn't know the man she was about to meet, or the ghosts he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten he still had a heart. Was it fate that brought her to his ridge, or was the mountain waiting for her too? By spring, the snow would melt, secrets would rise, and three hearts, four, counting his own, would begin to heal in ways no one thought possible. Some say he saved them. Others say they saved him. When a lonely cabin becomes a sanctuary and a wounded soul finds a reason to hope, one question lingers. Who did the healing? And who was brave enough to begin? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how stories like these bring us together, across prairies, cities, and every road in between. If you still believe in honor, second chances, and the strength of quiet love, then you belong here. Let me know which state you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so we can keep telling stories that matter. The wind cut sharp through the Missouri morning as Sarah Whitcomb stood at the edge of the wagon yard, clutching the hands of her two boys. Benjamin, the older at 9, kept his chin stiff, the way he'd learned from watching men too cruel to admire. Matthew, just 6, clung to her skirt and blinked up at her with eyes too tired for a child. The bruises on her wrists had faded, but the ones on her spirit had not. Behind her, the town shrank into a memory she would never miss, a place of whispers, judgment, and hands that had grabbed too hard. Her husband's death had not freed her. It had delivered her straight into the grasp of his kin, a house of shouting men and bitter women who saw her as nothing more than a burden with two mouths to feed. She had found the notice by accident, tucked inside an old Bible donated to the church's rummage box. It was yellowed, ink faded, but legible. Seeking virtuous, hard-working woman for homestead companionship. Widow preferred, children not unwelcome. Bitterroot Mountains, Montana Territory, EM. There was no date, no reply address, only the name of a post office in a place called Garnet. She read it again and again that night by candlelight while the boys slept on the floor beside her cot. She had no reason to trust it, but neither did she have any right to hope that someone would come and rescue them. There would be no miracles, just choices, and this was hers. With a trunk of worn clothes, a satchel of hard bread, and every penny hidden in her hem, Sarah bought 3 seats on a wagon train headed west. No one asked questions. Women traveling alone didn't often get answers, even if they had the courage to ask. The wagon master eyed her with something between suspicion and pity. She offered no story, just a quiet nod in the hands of her children, one on each side. The road was rough and unkind. Dust settled into every seam of their clothes. Nights brought the howl of coyotes and the whisper of regret. Sarah kept her chin up, even when the cold made Matthew whimper, or when Benjamin's stomach growled from another skipped meal. She bartered when she could, cleaned laundry for other travelers, and once sewed a wagon curtain in exchange for dried beans. But she never asked for charity. Her pride had taken enough from her already. At night by the fire, rumors flared among the travelers. One woman spoke of a man in Montana who lived alone in the mountains, scarred and dangerous. The beast of Bitterroot, they called him. He killed a man with a hammer, some say. Others say he buried his own child out there and went mad. Sarah said nothing, but her stomach twisted. Could it be him? E.M. Could she be walking her children into another kind of danger? But then she'd look at Matthew curled beneath the blanket, or Benjamin trying to read by firelight with a torn book, And she'd remember that safety was not something they'd ever truly known. She wasn't chasing dreams. She was running from ghosts. And if the mountain held more shadows, she'd face them with open eyes and steady hands. Because there was no turning back now, only forward, toward the Bitterroot, toward whatever waited at the end of the trail, and toward the man who had written words kind enough to imagine a woman with children as not unwelcome. The last bend in the trail came just as the sun vanished behind the mountain, casting a bruised light across the snow-packed ridge. The horses breathed steam into the air, hooves crunching over ice-crusted earth. Sarah gripped the wagon's sideboard, her fingers stiff with cold and nerves. Benjamin sat beside her, squinting through the trees. Matthew dozed against her shoulder, too tired to wonder where they were. When the cabin appeared, dark and low against the line of evergreens, it looked less like a home and more like something left behind by time. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and uncertain. He stepped out onto the porch before the wagon even stopped. Tall, broad, a shadow of a man wrapped in worn flannel and silence. Eli Morgan. She recognized the name the moment she saw his eyes. They held the same weight as the ink on that ad. Steady, rough, unsentimental. He did not move to help her down. He did not speak a welcome. He only stood, arms crossed, staring at the wagon's contents. When Benjamin jumped down with his knapsack and reached for Matthew, Eli's gaze flicked sharp. 2 children, unexpected. Sarah climbed down last, her legs nearly buckling under her own weight in the weight of her choice. She straightened her spine. "Mr. Morgan?" He gave a slight nod. "You're late," she swallowed. There were delays, weather, a broken axle. His eyes moved back to the boys. "You didn't mention children. I didn't think the letter would be read after all this time." He was quiet for a long stretch. Behind them, the wind picked up, whispering through the pine like something watching. Eli stepped off the porch. "Storm's coming. No sense standing here." He opened the cabin door without looking back. The inside was dark, lit only by a flickering oil lamp and the fire's last red coals. The room smelled of pine smoke, leather, and something older. Dust, perhaps, or memories. The walls were bare save for a single rifle above the hearth. A pot sat cold on the stove. "There's a room in back," Eli said, voice flat. "Used to be a storeroom. Has a bed." Sarah nodded, nudging the boys forward. Benjamin clutched Matthew's hand as they crossed the threshold. Their footsteps echoed louder than expected. Sarah turned to thank him, but he had already gone to the hearth, feeding the fire with split logs. She settled the boys in the back room, wrapping them in quilts and whispering that it was all right, that this place was safe, though she couldn't yet believe it herself. When she returned to the main room, Eli had laid out bread, jerky, and a jug of water. He didn't eat. He didn't sit. "I'll stay out of your way," she said quietly, folding her hands. He looked at her for the first time, really looked. Her face, lined with exhaustion, her dress patched and travel-worn, her eyes still holding something that hadn't been broken yet. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Neither are you." He grunted, almost a shrug. Then after a pause, "Don't worry, I don't take to hurting women or children." "I don't take to being pitied," she answered. That earned the barest twitch of his mouth, not quite a smile. He tossed another log on the fire. Thunder rumbled somewhere distant. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, they sat in silence. Not peace, but not war either. Just 2 lives, frayed at the edges, breathing the same warm air for the first time. Neither of them knew what came next, but neither had turned the other away. And in the quiet hush of the storm's approach, that was enough. The storm passed, but the cold stayed. A heavy, unmoving cold that crept through the trees and settled into the cabin like an uninvited guest. The fire stayed lit, but the silence burned hotter. Sarah rose early each morning, stoking the embers before the boys stirred, sweeping the floor with a worn broom, boiling water for porridge or washing. She moved quietly, hands always busy, eyes always watching the man who moved through the cabin like a shadow. Eli rose before the sun, often gone before the boys opened their eyes. They heard the thunk of his axe in the distance, the crack of gunfire on the ridge, the scrape of boots on the porch when he returned, carrying game slung over one shoulder. He would clean it in the lean-to, then vanish again to split wood, stack it, carry it to the pile as if the world depended on order. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was simple and to the point. Eat. Close the door. Don't leave the path. His voice wasn't cruel, but it cut like wind over stone, sharp and bare. The boys kept their distance, whispering when they thought Sarah couldn't hear. He's got a scar, Benjamin said, right here under his jaw. Matthew nodded solemnly. He don't blink much either. They stayed close to Sarah, following her from room to room, and she kept her tone light for them, humming while she swept, telling quiet stories while they ate. But her eyes often flicked toward the door, wondering if Eli was listening, if he resented the sound. One afternoon, while cleaning the shelf near the hearth, Matthew reached too far. The butt of Eli's rifle, propped against the stones, toppled and struck the floor with a heavy crack. The child froze. Benjamin's face drained of color. The cabin fell deathly still. Eli was on the porch, skin powdered with sawdust, snow on his shoulders. He stepped inside slowly, eyes locked on the weapon. Sarah stepped in front of the boys. It was an accident, she said, heart pounding. He didn't mean to. But Eli didn't shout, didn't curse. He walked past them, lifted the rifle, checked the stock for damage. His hands trembled once, barely visible. Then without a word, he walked back out the door. They watched through the window as he strode into the snow-covered clearing, his figure growing smaller until he vanished into the trees. Sarah's breath left her like a held-in sigh. The boys didn't speak. That evening, he didn't return until the sky was black. He didn't eat. He went straight to his room and shut the door. After the boys fell asleep, Sarah sat alone by the fire, listening to the wind tug at the walls. Her fingers worked at mending a torn sleeve, but her thoughts kept drifting. It wasn't fear she'd seen in Eli's face when the rifle fell. It was something deeper, shock maybe, or memory. She began to wonder if the silence that hung between them wasn't meant to push her out. Maybe it was the only thing holding him together, and maybe, just maybe, it was starting to crack. The sun dipped early that day, casting the cabin in long shadows that stretched across the plank floor like reaching arms. Sarah had spent the better part of the afternoon scouring the small pantry and root cellar. Flour, salt, some dried beans, a wedge of smoked pork. It wasn't much, but it was more than what she'd had on most nights since Missouri. Her hands moved with purpose, sleeves rolled, apron tied, heat from the stove warming her cheeks and loosening the tension in her shoulders. She hadn't asked Eli. She hadn't needed to. This was her offering, not a favor. A proper supper, for the boys and maybe for herself. The scent of pork frying in the cast iron pan brought the children out of the back room like moths to a flame. Benjamin peeked over her shoulder while Matthew dragged a stool close, eyes wide with hunger and hope. Sarah shooed them gently toward the table, her voice softer than it had been in days. The door creaked open just as she was ladling beans into the chip bowls. Eli stepped in, his coat dusted with frost, his boots wet at the edges. He paused when he saw the table, plates set, cups filled, warm food waiting. I thought it was time, Sarah said, not looking up from the pot. For something real. He said nothing, only removed his coat and hung it near the fire. They all sat except him. He stood a long moment, then pulled out the chair nearest the hearth and lowered himself into it. Not at the table, but not in the shadows either. Benjamin picked up his fork. Mama, is this pork? Sarah smiled. Don't talk with your mouth full. And yes, it is. Matthew giggled, a sound so light it startled the room. Eli glanced up. The boys devoured the meal like they hadn't eaten in weeks. And maybe in a way they hadn't. Not like this. Not warm, not safe, not together. Sarah stole a glance toward Eli. His arms were folded, but his gaze lingered on the boys. Something passed over his face, brief, unreadable. After supper, Sarah gathered the dishes. The boys cleared their spots without being told. Eli rose without a word and added another log to the fire. The flames brightened, casting gold across the room, warming the spaces that had felt hollow just days before. When Sarah returned from the wash basin, she found him still standing by the hearth. He didn't move toward his usual chair in the corner. Instead, he took the one opposite the boys, the one left empty. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The fire crackled, the walls breathed, and for the first time since she arrived, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt full. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Sarah stood by the table, smoothing the folded cloth. Eli looked up at her. "They needed that," he said. "So did I," she replied. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away. Outside, the frost crept down the window panes. Inside, the air held something warmer. Not just heat, but presence, life. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a place to hide from the world. It felt like a place someone might choose to stay. The snow had settled thick and white across the ridge, softening the world into silence. It muffled every step, every sound, as if winter itself were holding its breath. Sarah was pouring hot water into the wash basin when she heard the boys at the window, their voices hushed and urgent. "Look, Ben! Right there!" Matthew pressed his finger to the frost-laced glass. Benjamin squinted. "Tracks. They weren't there yesterday." Sarah moved to see. A winding trail of delicate prints stretched across the snow near the tree line. Small, careful, no larger than a teacup. The boys were already bundling up before she could say a word. "You stay close to the cabin," she warned. "Don't go past the stump." They nodded, but before they reached the door, Eli stepped inside, snow melting on his shoulders. He glanced at the boys, then followed their gaze to the prints. "Fox," he said simply. Matthew's eyes widened. "Really?" Eli nodded once. "Want to see where it went?" The boys looked to Sarah. She hesitated, but the way their eyes shone, not with fear, but with hope, she nodded. "Stay where he tells you. No wandering." Eli didn't offer his hand or smile. He just turned and stepped back into the cold. The boys followed without hesitation, their small boots crunching in the snow behind his long strides. Sarah watched from the window, breath fogging the glass. The three of them moved like figures in a snow globe, quiet, enclosed in another world. She couldn't hear what he was saying, if he spoke at all, but she saw the way Benjamin leaned in when Eli pointed to a tree trunk, how Matthew nearly danced when Eli brushed snow aside to reveal a delicate nest tucked beneath fallen branches. At one point, Eli knelt and lifted Matthew high so he could peer into a tree hollow. Benjamin climbed onto a rock, craning to see too. Sarah pressed her hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the sight. A man who hadn't said more than a handful of words to her children, now leading them through the woods like some silent guardian. They returned just before dusk, cheeks flushed, boots wet. The boys burst through the door, breathless. "We saw a fox den," Benjamin shouted, "and he showed us where a rabbit chewed the bark on a willow. He lifted me to see a bird's nest," Matthew added. "Real high up." Sarah smiled and ushered them to the fire. "Take your boots off before you track snow everywhere." As she wrapped the boys in blankets, Benjamin looked toward Eli, who was brushing off his coat. "Thanks, Mr. Morgan," he said shyly. Matthew echoed him. "Yeah, thank you, Mr. Morgan." Eli paused, eyes lingering on them both. "You're welcome." Later that night, after the boys were asleep and the fire had settled into a gentle glow, Sarah stood near the hearth. Eli sat sharpening a blade, methodical and quiet. "Thank you," she said softly, "for showing them, for giving them that." He didn't look up, just nodded once. "Boys ought to know the woods." His voice held no warmth, but his eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked up for a heartbeat. There was something there. Not affection, not yet, but recognition maybe. Or remembrance. Sarah said no more. She returned to her chair, listening to the sound of the whetstone and the wind outside. The cabin, once so still, now hummed with a quiet life. And the man once called a beast had, today, shown two small boys the hidden heart of the forest. It was laundry that brought her to the back corner of the cabin. A sagging wicker basket full of damp linens had slipped from her hip, scattering clothes across the floor. As she stooped to gather them, her hand brushed a wooden panel she hadn't noticed before. It was a door, narrow, set deeper into the wall than the others, nearly hidden behind a row of old coats and tools. It bore no handle, only an iron keyhole dark with age. Locked. Sarah stood slowly, arms full of fabric, staring at it. The rest of the cabin was open. If sparse, nothing Eli seemed to guard or value beyond the tools of survival. But this door was different. It whispered of something older than privacy, something not meant to be remembered. She didn't touch it again. She didn't call attention to it. But the weight of it lingered in her thoughts like the chill that never quite left her bones. Later, while hanging the last of the linens to dry near the hearth, she caught Eli watching her from across the room. His eyes flicked past her to the hall, to that back corner. "I was just doing laundry," she said quietly. He said nothing, only turned back to the fire. No explanation, no warning, no anger either. That night the wind shifted. A thunderhead rolled over the ridge, sudden and brutal. Lightning lit the sky in jagged streaks. The walls of the cabin creaked with each gust. Rain battered the roof like fists demanding entry. Matthew woke first, crying out, his voice cracking with fear. Sarah rose quickly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. But before she could reach the boy's room, Eli was already there. She paused in the hallway, hidden by the doorframe, watching. He knelt beside Matthew's bed, one large hand resting lightly on the boy's back. He didn't speak. He didn't shush. He simply sat with him, steady and silent, until the boy's sobs quieted into whimpers, then sighs, then sleep. Benjamin turned in his sleep but didn't wake. Eli remained kneeling long after the storm's worst had passed, the room lit only by the faint glow from the hearth beyond the door. Sarah stood motionless, her hand pressed to the wall for balance. She'd known many kinds of silence in her life, some cruel, some frightened, some cold. But this was different. This was a man who carried sorrow like armor, who held himself apart not out of disdain, but out of caution, as if every kind gesture cost him something unseen. When Eli finally rose and stepped into the hallway, he did not seem surprised to find her there. He didn't speak. Their eyes met briefly, long enough for Sarah to see that something in him, something once buried beneath snow and silence, had stirred. He walked past her without a word, returned to his chair by the fire, and stared into the coals like they might tell him what to do next. Sarah lingered a moment longer, glancing once more toward the locked door in the back. She didn't need a key to know it hid more than old belongings. There were rooms in all of them still closed tight, but not forever. Something was shifting, and not just in the weather. The days unfolded in a rhythm, quiet but no longer empty. Snow still rimmed the cabin roof, and the trees stood thick and silent around them. But something unseen had softened, not completely, but enough to let warmth settle in the corners. Sarah began to sew again. She found a stack of old shirts, torn flannel, a worn feed sack, and pieces of a flowered dress too threadbare to wear. Her fingers, calloused and sure, began to stitch them together in the evenings. She didn't ask permission. She just spread the fabric on the table after supper and worked by firelight while the boys played with pine cones or carved sticks into pretend horses. It started as something to pass the time, but soon it became something else. Each square a story, each stitch a quiet insistence that beauty still had a place, even here, even now. Eli didn't say anything the first few nights, just glanced once or twice at the growing patchwork, then returned to whittling or oiling his tools. But one morning Sarah woke to find her stovepipe, once bent and leaking smoke, repaired with a clean section of tin and a brace screwed neatly into the wall. She didn't hear him do it, didn't see him measure or cut. But the cabin was warmer now. The smoke rose true. The boys noticed it too. "Did Mr. Morgan fix it?" Benjamin asked over breakfast. Sarah nodded. "He must have." Later that week, Eli began rising later in the mornings, not late, but not gone before dawn either. One morning, without comment, he handed Benjamin a coiled piece of twine and showed him how to tie a snare. He motioned for Matthew to follow, and they walked to the edge of the trees where he showed them how to look for tracks, where to place the trap, what signs to watch for. He spoke little, but the boys listened like his words were scripture. Sarah watched from the porch, her quilt resting in her lap. The man she had feared that first night now crouched beside her sons, pointing to claw marks on a log, brushing snow aside to reveal the thin trail of a rabbit. A few mornings later, while the boys cleaned fish outside, Eli stepped back into the cabin with something wrapped in an old cloth. He placed it gently on the table. Sarah looked up, wiping her hands. He unwrapped it. A rifle. Well worn but polished. She froze. "What's that for?" "You," he said. Her hands went still. "I don't want it. I ain't asking you to use it, just to know it." She hesitated, the weight of her old life pressing against the new. But when he extended it, gently, but first, she took it. It was heavier than she expected. He showed her how to rest it against her shoulder, how to check the chamber, how to stand. His hands never touched her, but his voice was low and even. "In case I'm not here one day," he said, "you ought to know." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not fear, not burden, possibility. He was no longer treating her like a guest or a burden. He was teaching her to stay. The fire burned low that night, casting long shadows that flickered across the wooden floor. The boys had fallen asleep early, worn out from a day of trapping with Eli and trudging through the snow. Their soft breathing echoed faintly from the back room. Sarah sat near the hearth, her quilt draped across her knees, needle resting idle in her hand. Outside, wind rattled the eaves. Inside, the cabin pulsed with quiet. Eli sat in his usual chair, the one angled toward the fire, but never quite facing it. He had said little all evening, only offering a quiet "pass the salt" at supper and a nod when Matthew told him about the rabbit prints near the creek. He was like that, present, steady, but always holding back a piece of himself, as if he feared what might slip through if he let it all out. Sarah looked at him through the fire's haze. For weeks now they had danced around a question she hadn't dared ask. But the silence tonight didn't feel heavy. It felt ready. She shifted, setting the quilt aside, voice low. "Why did you place the ad?" Eli didn't answer at first. He reached down and poked the coals with the iron rod, sparks jumping. The silence stretched until she thought he might ignore it altogether. But then he leaned back, rubbed a hand across his jaw, and spoke. Slow, like he was pulling words from a place too long buried. "Her name was Clara," he said. "We came here 15 years ago. She wanted quiet. Said the noise of town never let her breathe right." Sarah folded her hands and waited. She was 6 months along when the snow came in early. By the time the baby came, the pass was already closed. No midwife, just me and the Lord. He stopped, swallowed hard. The fire crackled. Clara died the next morning. Our daughter lived 3 days. The words didn't shake. They were too old for that. But each one landed like a weight placed gently on the floor, not thrown, not dropped, just heavy. I buried them both behind the ridge, marked the spot with pine and stone. Then I boarded up the room and didn't step foot in it again. Sarah felt the tears rise behind her eyes but didn't let them fall. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was offering truth. I put that ad in the paper a year after. Thought maybe if someone came, I'd have a reason to clear out the shadows. But no one did. His voice lowered, almost lost in the fire. Until you. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The fire dimmed, its orange light dancing along the walls, warming the space between them. Eli didn't look at her, but she felt the shift, like a door creaking open after being stuck for years. She rose quietly and placed another log on the fire. Then she sat back down, closer than before, but not close enough to disturb him. They sat like that for a long while, two souls breathing in the same hush, the past no longer locked away, but spoken aloud and held gently in the room between them. And in that silence, something broke loose, not loudly, not all at once, but enough to begin again. The morning was quiet, save for the steady drip of melting snow from the cabin eaves. Winter was softening, just slightly, and patches of earth peeked through the white like old secrets being slowly revealed. Sarah was outside, hanging damp linens on the line, fingers stiff in the cold, but her breath steady and warm. She heard the horse before she saw it, the distant clop of hooves echoing down the ridge trail. Eli stepped out from the lean-to, where he'd been sharpening his axe. His eyes narrowed, hand going instinctively to the rifle leaned by the porch. A lone rider came into view, wrapped in a canvas coat, hat pulled low, horse lathered from the climb. The man didn't dismount. He reached into his satchel and held out a folded paper. Notice from the county seat. You're on Roper's list. Eli didn't take it at first. He just stared, eyes flat as river stones. The rider shrugged, let the paper fall to the porch boards, then turned his horse and rode off without another word. Sarah moved to the steps, wiping her hands on her apron. Roper? Eli bent to pick up the paper, unfolded it slowly. His mouth tightened. Railroad man, he said. Bought up half the valley last year. Now he's coming for the ridge. She came closer. How can he just take land? He buys judges, pays surveyors to redraw lines. If your deed's weak or missing, he claims it's unoccupied or misfiled. Then he moves in. Sarah's stomach sank. She'd seen men like that. Her husband's cousin had worked for one, bulldozing land from grieving widows, calling it progress. Do you have papers? She asked. Eli didn't answer right away. He folded the notice with deliberate care, as if the slow act might hold back the heat rising in him. Somewhere, he said, old deed from Clara's pa. Ain't looked at it in years. Sarah watched the lines of his face shift, not in fear but in fury, controlled, cold, the kind of anger that didn't shout but settled deep in the bones. I ain't giving up this land, he said, voice low and final. Not to him, not to anyone. The words settled between them like stones, heavy and immovable. Sarah looked out toward the edge of the ridge, to the place where the boys had built a small snow fort the day before, where the pines stood tall and rooted. She felt something rise in her chest, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since Missouri. Not just fear or worry or weariness, but belonging. This cabin, these woods. The warmth at night in the hush of morning, the smell of pine smoke, and the way Matthew laughed now without flinching. This place wasn't just a stop along the way. It was becoming home. She reached out and took the folded paper from Eli's hand. Then we fight, she said. He looked at her, really looked, and gave the faintest nod. No smile, no promises, but agreement. Together they turned toward the door. Trouble had come to the ridge, but so had something else. Something harder to displace, something worth standing for. Down in the valley town of Garnet, the talk began with a single rider, same man who delivered Roper's notice. By the time he tied his horse outside the general store, the story had already grown legs of its own. The mountain man's taken in a woman, he muttered over a cup of coffee, and 2 children, if you believe it. Old Tom at the blacksmith's bench leaned in. You mean Eli Morgan? That beast still lives? More than live, said the rider. Got a young widow cooking in his kitchen. Boys running about the yard like it's a schoolhouse. Within a day, the news had scattered like wildfire. At the feed store, they said she must be a prisoner. At the church steps, someone whispered she'd tricked him into keeping her. At the tavern, talk turned darker. Tales of the man who'd lost his mind when his wife bled out on a snowy night, who buried a baby alone, who'd sworn off humanity with a rifle in one hand and a shovel in the other. Maybe she's just like him, someone muttered. Maybe she's not right either. But not all ears took in those words with ease. Midwife Alma Jean heard it from a shop girl who lowered her voice too late. Alma straightened her spine and turned slow, looking the girl full in the face. I delivered Clara Morgan's child, she said. Held that baby when it passed. I watched Eli dig 2 graves with his own hands and never once asked for help. The girl's eyes widened, shame prickling her cheeks. Alma leaned in closer. You don't know pain like that, but Sarah Whitcomb does. I can see it in the way she stands. And if he's opened that door for her, then he's not the beast you think he is. That Sunday, Alma packed a satchel of dry goods, fresh bread, a jar of apple preserves, and her best tin of salve. She hitched her mule and made the journey up the ridge, not waiting for an invitation. Eli opened the door without a word. She stepped inside and looked around. The place was cleaner than she expected, warm with firelight and the smell of herbs. Sarah stood near the stove, hands flour-dusted, her face calm but alert. Alma smiled. Brought some things you might find useful. Bread, mostly. And talk if you're needing any. Sarah blinked, surprised. You're the first visitor we've had. Well then, Alma said, setting her satchel down. I reckon it's about time someone came without a threat tucked in their coat. She sat at the table, took a mug of tea from Sarah's trembling hands and told stories. Soft, winding tales about Clara, about the town's stubborn ways, about how folks sometimes need time to catch up with what's good. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry, but when she looked at Eli, she saw something steadier than legend, something quieter than rage. And when she looked at Sarah, she saw herself, years younger, worn at the edges, but still standing. You're not alone up here, Alma said before she left. Not as long as I've got breath. Sarah watched her go, hand resting lightly on the doorframe. The town might whisper. But now there was one voice speaking truth, and sometimes one was enough to drown out the rest. The thaw came slow, creeping in with longer days, and the faint smell of wet earth. Snow melted in patches, revealing muddy ground speckled with pine needles and last year's dead grass. Sarah stood outside one morning, her apron tugged by the breeze, staring at a small stretch of land just beside the cabin, flat, sheltered, and still rimmed with snow at the edges. She crouched down and touched the ground. It was cold but softening. She pressed her hand into it, feeling the give, the faint promise. When Eli passed by carrying firewood, she didn't ask. She just said, I think I'll plant something here. He paused, looked at the frozen edge of the soil, then at her. Still frost in the ground, he said. I know, she replied, brushing dirt from her fingers. But not forever. The next day, she brought out a rusted trowel she'd found in a box beneath the porch. She started scraping at the dirt, breaking apart clumps, tossing aside dead roots and small stones. The boys joined in, pulling sticks, laughing when they found a worm. Eli watched from the steps. Then, without a word, he disappeared into the shed and returned with a spade. He began clearing the rockier side, working beside her in silence. The earth gave way under his strength, and Sarah worked beside him, slower but determined. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. He handed her a sack of seeds, parsley, sage, thyme, old but usable. She nodded and tucked them in her apron. Benjamin drew signs on bits of scrap wood, mint in crooked letters, though they had no mint yet. Matthew made a sun with a smile in the middle and stuck it into the ground by a small mound of chives. Sarah found herself humming as she worked, the tune low and half forgotten. She'd sung it once while rocking a baby that hadn't lived. But here, in the turning soil, it came back without ache. That evening, Eli brought out a small bench, simple, sturdy. He set it beside the garden near the edge of the trees. Sarah blinked at it, her hands still dirt-streaked. "You built this?" He nodded, brushing sawdust from his shirt. "Figured you might want a place to sit." She looked at the bench, then back at him. "Thank you." He didn't smile, but his eyes held her longer than usual, searching, soft in a way she hadn't seen before. Then he turned, heading back to the woodpile. The garden grew in fits and starts over the next days, soil still half frozen in places. But something had shifted, not just in the ground, but in them. Once this patch of earth had held nothing but shadow and frost. Now it cradled something new, something tender and brave. And as Sarah sat on the bench with Matthew curled beside her, watching Benjamin chase a sparrow from the thyme bed, she realized she'd planted more than herbs. She'd planted roots. The sound of hooves broke the quiet that had settled over the ridge. It came sharp and sudden, like the snap of a brittle branch underfoot. Sarah looked up from the garden, hands stilled in the soil. Benjamin and Matthew, crouched near the chives, froze mid-laugh. A dust trail twisted upward from the trail below, and with it came the metallic glint of rifles. Eli stepped out from the shed, axe in hand. He didn't speak, didn't move toward them. Just watched as 3 men on horseback crested the path, and behind them came a fourth, well-fed, well-dressed, and wearing a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Eli Morgan," the man drawled as he dismounted. "Still breathing, I see." Eli didn't answer. The man dusted his coat. "Roper," he said, turning towards Sarah without waiting for a handshake. "Land agent, official representative of the Copper Spur and westward expansion. That ridge you're sitting on? You're about to be trespassers on it." He scanned the cabin, the garden, the children. His eyes narrowed on Sarah. "Didn't know the beast took in strays." Benjamin stepped closer to his mother. Matthew gripped her skirt. Eli didn't rise to the bait. He set the axe down, slow and deliberate. "What do you want?" "Deed," Roper said. "Legal proof you've got claim to this land. Otherwise, I've got every right to run a line of steel through it come summer." Sarah's breath came shallow. Her hands, still streaked with dirt, trembled at her sides. Eli remained still, jaw tight, eyes steady. "I said," Roper continued louder, "show me your deed or start packing." Something cracked inside her. Maybe it was the way Roper's words cut through the air, or maybe it was the memory of other men, back in Missouri, who thought they could scare silence into her. Sarah stepped forward. Her voice was small, but it didn't waver. "This is our home." Roper turned, almost amused. "Our?" She nodded, chin lifting. "We've bled here, worked here, raised children here. This place lives because we do. I don't care what you claim on paper. You'll not take that with threats." Roper stared at her a long moment. Then he smiled. Not kind, not warm, just slow and sharp. "You'll wish you'd packed when I come back," he said. "And I will come back." He turned to his men. They mounted and rode off, leaving churned earth and silence in their wake. Eli said nothing, just watched them disappear beyond the trees. That night, when the boys were asleep and the cabin had settled into the hush of firelight, Sarah found him out back. He was kneeling in the dark, earth piled beside him. His hands moved with care, brushing dirt from something wrapped in stained oilcloth. He didn't look up as she approached. "Wasn't sure I'd ever need it again," he said, voice low. She watched as he unwrapped the bundle. A deed, folded and dry, signed in ink, faded but legible. "Clara's father gave it to us," he added. "Never filed proper with the new registrar when they changed the counties. Should've, didn't." He held it gently, like something fragile. Sarah knelt beside him. "It's not too late." He nodded, not quite meeting her eyes, but his hand tightened around the paper. For the first time since the snow began to melt, the earth wasn't just giving way to new life. It was giving up the past, paper-wrapped, grief-bound, and finally ready to fight. The wind blew hot and restless, like it carried word of trouble before anyone could speak it aloud. Dust curled in from the trail as Alma Jean arrived again, her mule panting hard, her shawl pulled tight despite the warmth in the air. She didn't wait for tea this time. She stepped straight into the cabin, her mouth set in a grim line. "Roper's gone to the county judge," she said without preamble. "Filed a notice of intent to seize. He's saying your claim is void. Said this land's unoccupied on record. You've got weeks, maybe less." Eli stood near the hearth, silent as always, his broad shoulders casting long shadows on the wall. He didn't flinch, but Sarah saw it in his eyes, a flicker of fire that had nothing to do with fear. "We've got the deed," he said. "Clara's father signed it." Alma nodded. "Might hold up, might not. Depends on the judge. Depends on how much silver Roper's put in the right pockets. But it's something. If you want a chance, you'll need to write." She looked to Sarah. "Both of you." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Me?" Alma leaned on the table, eyes steady. "You've got a story, girl. You write it plain and true. Don't flower it up. Don't hide the bruises. Show the judge what kind of man lives here now and why you stayed." That night, after the boys were asleep and the cabin had gone still, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her fingers trembling over a sheet of yellowed paper. A stub of pencil lay beside her, sharp as truth. Eli placed the deed down quietly next to her, wrapped now in clean cloth, edges pressed flat. He didn't offer words. He didn't need to. Sarah took a deep breath and began. "To the Honorable Judge of County District 5, she wrote, her letters careful, her voice quiet but clear. "My name is Sarah Whitcomb. I was once the property of cruel hands. I fled Missouri with 2 children and no hope, answering a newspaper ad left forgotten. I thought I was coming to marry a stranger, but I found something better. I found a protector." The words poured from her like water cracked through stone. She wrote of Missouri, of the eyes that looked past her hunger, past her pain. She wrote of nights she'd lain awake afraid to breathe too loud, and of the first morning she saw her sons laugh in Eli's yard. "He did not raise his voice," she wrote. "He did not raise his hand. He raised my sons. He raised us all." She paused then, her hand trembling, tears tracing the corners of her face. But she didn't stop. "Eli Morgan may not own a banknote or a gold ring, but he owns this land with the sweat of 15 winters and the graves of 2 loved ones buried under stone and pine. He is not a beast. He is the first safe place my children have ever known." She signed her name with a slow, deliberate stroke. Eli took the letter when she finished and held it gently, like it might fall apart under too much pressure. He said nothing, but his jaw clenched once, then eased. The next morning, Alma rode back down to town with a sealed envelope pressed to her chest. The deed folded inside. Sarah's letter atop it, like a final word. The law might favor money. But now it had something heavier. Truth, worn and weathered, but still standing tall on a ridge that refused to be taken. The bell above the general store door rang hard that morning as Alma Jean pushed it open, her boots tracking red dust across the floor. She carried nothing but her voice, sharp and sure, and a letter clutched tight in her hand. Behind the counter, Lila the shopkeeper looked up, wary. Two old men by the barrel of nails fell quiet mid-conversation. Alma didn't pause. "He's filing false claims again," she said, loud enough for the walls to hear. "Roper, trying to steal Eli Morgan's land, and he's coming with a judge's ear full of lies." Lila's lips pressed into a tight line. "If Morgan don't have a deed, I reckon it ain't his anyhow." Alma stepped closer. "He's got a deed, and a family. A woman and two children who found peace where no one else gave it to them. Roper don't care about paperwork. He only cares about taking what he can't earn." The silence thickened. Then old Amos Black from the livery stepped forward, voice gravel-worn. "Roper evicted my sister after her husband passed, claimed her barn was on county land, burned it down with her sow inside." Others nodded. Whispers spread down the line of the store, across the porch, out into the street like wind in dry grass. By midday, Alma had stopped at the blacksmith's, the church, and the mill. Her story didn't change. Roper's coming for the mountain, and it starts with Eli Morgan. The blacksmith, a broad man named Harlan with soot on his shirt and an old scar under one eye, crossed his arms. "Morgan once pulled me out from under a collapsed cart. Didn't say a word, just lifted it like I was nothing. Folks forget that part." "You willing to say that to a judge?" Alma asked. He nodded once. "I am." Even Reverend Cole, who had long kept his distance from gossip and grudges, offered something more than scripture. He invited Alma to speak before the congregation. That Sunday she stood at the front of the chapel, voice ringing out beneath the stained glass cross. "This isn't just about a man," she said. "It's about decency, about standing up when something good is being threatened. Eli Morgan isn't the beast some of you feared. He's the one building something honest up there on that ridge." The next day, a gathering was called at the town hall. The benches filled faster than they had in months. Widows, farmers, shopkeepers, even men who once crossed the street to avoid Eli now leaned forward with furrowed brows and folded hands. One by one, they shared what they knew. Of Roper's forced evictions, of deeds buried, of families driven out by men with smooth smiles and thick coin. The tide had shifted, not loud, not violent, just steady. For the first time in years, the town was waking up, not to fear, but to justice. And on a cabin ridge miles above, Sarah tended her herbs while the boys ran laughing through thawed grass. Unaware that far below, hearts were changing. Eli sat on the porch watching the horizon, the weight of old rumor lifting like mist at dawn. The town, at long last, was choosing the right side. The town hall brimmed with bodies, the air thick with heat and murmurs. Boots scraped against the pinewood floor, and voices buzzed like hornets under the rafters. Roper stood at the front, hands folded behind his back, a confident smirk twitching beneath his trimmed mustache. He wore a new coat, black and pressed, the kind men like him donned when they wanted to look respectable. On the table beside him lay a rolled map, a thick stack of claims, and the sharp glint of arrogance. The judge, a pale man with a weathered face and ink-stained fingers, sat at a long table in the center, his expression unreadable. Behind him hung the dusty county seal, its edges frayed from years of looking past the truth. Roper stepped forward and unrolled the map with a flourish. "As you can see," he said, tapping a marked grid with a polished stick, "this ridge land lies just outside the registered parcels. No legal deed has been filed since county redistricting. He flashed a thin smile to the crowd. Meaning it's unclaimed. Meaning it's mine. There were a few nods, hesitant, uncertain. But then Reverend Cole stood. He held a folded sheet of paper, slightly worn at the edges. He raised his hand, and the murmurs fell quiet. His voice rang clear and steady. This letter, he began, was written by a woman named Sarah Whitcomb, a widow, a mother, a survivor. She lives on that ridge, not because she was chased there, but because she found something no one in this valley ever offered her: peace, safety, dignity. He unfolded the letter and began to read. I thought I was coming to marry a stranger, but I found something better. I found a protector. Sarah sat in the back of the room, chin lifted, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Benjamin and Matthew sat beside her, eyes wide. Every sentence of her letter echoed through the hall like a hymn. When the preacher finished, the judge looked to Roper. You say the land is unclaimed, yet here is testimony from a woman living on it. And I've received an affidavit with a signed deed, bearing the mark of Clara Barlow Morgan's father. Roper's smile faltered. Old papers don't mean anything under new county lines. Eli stepped forward then, moving with quiet certainty. The room shifted, men straightening, some moving aside to let him pass. He stood tall, coat dusty, hands weathered, eyes fixed on the judge. But his words were for everyone. I built that cabin with my own hands. I buried my wife and daughter on that land. 15 winters I've watched it grow wild and quiet. Then Sarah came, and with her, life returned. I lost my family once. His voice dropped, rough and low. I ain't losing another. Silence pressed down like snowfall. The judge cleared his throat. I've reviewed the deed in the letter. I find in favor of Eli Morgan. The claim by Mr. Roper is hereby dismissed. He is to vacate any pursuit of the property immediately. There was a pause, just one heartbeat, before the room broke into a low ripple of nods and relief. Roper clenched his jaw. You'll regret this, he muttered. But no one was listening to him anymore. Justice, long denied, had finally taken its rightful seat. The wind on the ridge that evening was softer than usual, curling through the trees like a sigh long held. The cabin stood quiet under a sky brushed with gold, the last light of day warming the window panes. Inside, the fire crackled low, supper dishes cleaned and set aside. The boys were on the floor, sketching with charcoal on scraps of parchment, while Sarah stitched the last edge of her quilt with careful, practiced hands. Eli stood near the hallway, staring down the narrow passage that led to the far back corner. His hand rested on the wall, fingers brushing the grain of the wood as though feeling the pulse of something buried beneath it. His shoulders were rigid, but his eyes were not hard. They were still. Sarah looked up from her sewing. He met her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. Years of silence, pain, memory, and the slow thaw of trust. He nodded once. It's time, he said. He reached into the drawer beneath the bookshelf and pulled out a small iron key. It was rusted but whole. The boys stopped drawing, their eyes following him as he walked to the door that had always stayed closed, the one Sarah had found months ago, half hidden, untouched. He slipped the key into the lock. It clicked with a quiet finality. The door creaked open, and the air inside was cool, undisturbed. Dust motes floated in the fading light that spilled through the doorway. The room was small, simple. A cradle sat near the window, carved by hand and still cradling a folded quilt the size of a pillow. A tiny pair of shoes rested on a shelf beside a worn shawl. The threads faded but lovingly mended in one corner. The scent of cedar lingered, old and soft. Eli stepped inside and breathed deep, his hands at his sides, eyes moving slowly over each item. Sarah followed, gently taking the boy's hands. They stood behind him, quiet and reverent. Benjamin looked at the cradle and then at Eli, saying nothing, only nodding once as though understanding something too big to name. Eli turned towards Sarah. I couldn't bring myself to let it go, but I think it was never meant to stay shut. She stepped forward, laying her quilt over the bed in the corner of the room. The deep blues and soft reds blended with the wood like it had always belonged there. Her fingers smoothed it flat as if calming something restless. Matthew wandered over to the wall, holding one of the drawings he'd made, a smiling woman in a garden, two stick-figure boys beside her, a tall man with a beard behind them all. He pressed it onto the wall near the window, pinning it with a thumbtack found on the desk. No more ghosts, Sarah whispered, her voice full of peace, not sorrow. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, the cradle beside his knee. He placed one hand on the shawl, his thumb brushing a corner seam. The pain hadn't left him. It never would. But it no longer kept him closed. It no longer kept the door locked. The room wasn't a shrine now. It was part of the home again, part of a life still being lived. And for the first time in 15 years, Eli Morgan didn't feel alone in it. Spring rose gentle and green on the ridge, washing the trees in soft buds and coaxing color from the earth, where for so long there had only been frost. The garden, once a patch of stubborn soil, now burst with parsley, thyme, and green shoots that reached toward the sun like small hands. Bees buzzed between the wildflowers edging the path, and the air was warm with the scent of pine and turned loam. Eli rose each morning with the light, no longer out of habit, but out of purpose. He worked the land with calm precision, but his hands had taken on a new kind of rhythm, less urgent, more thoughtful. Behind the main cabin, he had begun to build again. With each board laid and each nail driven, a small house took shape just down the ridge. A second cabin, not large but sturdy and open. For the boys, he said one day when Sarah asked, her hand resting on the garden gate, someday they'll want their own place, and I want them to have it close. She didn't answer, just smiled, the kind that reached all the way into the soft places that used to ache. Afternoons passed beneath the trees. Sarah sat on a quilt with a book in her lap, teaching Matthew to sound out each word while Benjamin, now reading full paragraphs, helped trace letters in the dirt with a stick. Birds sang overhead, and the breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed pine. The laughter of children no longer sounded strange on the ridge. It belonged there now, woven into the rhythm of the place. Eli often carved in the evenings, sitting by the fire with a block of wood in one hand and his knife in the other. He made a fox once, smooth and small, then a pair of sparrows, then a little cabin no bigger than a palm. He gave each carving to the boys without a word, placing them on their beds like gifts left by some quiet spirit. One night after the children had gone to sleep and the fire crackled low, Eli sat beside Sarah on the porch bench he'd made the summer before. The sky above was deep blue, the stars sharp in their stillness. The quiet between them was no longer uncertain. It was full, like a well that never ran dry. I never needed a bride, he said, his voice just above a whisper. I needed a reason. Sarah turned toward him. Her hand, calloused and warm, found his. She didn't speak. No vows were exchanged. No rings passed between fingers. There was no witness but the trees and the stars. And yet everything had changed. What they had wasn't forged in ceremony, but in hard winters, long silences, shared sorrow, and healing laughter. It was built nail by nail, meal by meal, word by halting word, not family by blood, but by choice, by care. And that, Sarah knew, was the strongest kind there was. The years passed softly on the ridge, like the slow unfolding of a quilt stitched by steady hands. Time smoothed the edges of what once was sharp. The winters still came hard and the winds still howled through the pines, but they no longer sounded like mourning. They sounded like music, like memory. Words spread across the valley and beyond, as all good stories do. Folks still spoke of the widow who came with nothing but two boys and a quiet fire in her heart. They remembered the man she found, grizzled, feared, all but forgotten, who gave her shelter, then gave her everything else without knowing it. At the edge of the garden, where the soil had once been scraped bare through frozen ground, rows of herbs now swayed in the breeze. Lavender, rosemary, mint, finally. Alma Jean, her hair white as snow, often came to kneel beside the plants, humming to herself as she plucked leaves with gentle fingers. Children's voices floated through the trees on most days, trailing from the little schoolhouse Eli had helped build just down the path from the second cabin. What started with Sarah teaching her own sons grew into something bigger. The townsfolk had asked, gently at first, then insistently, if she'd take on their young ones too. And so she did. Under the open sky, reading lessons and arithmetic took place on stumps and blankets. Sarah's voice carried through the trees, steady as ever. The same voice that once trembled when she first set foot on this land now guided the next generation with the quiet power of someone who had survived the worst and built something lasting in its place. Eli grew older, but the strength in his frame never truly left him. He walked the woods with Benjamin and Matthew, now taller, broader, strong in their own ways. He showed them how to move through the forest like a part of it, how to hunt not for sport, but for sustenance, with respect. Take only what you need, he would say, and leave thanks behind. On Sundays, Reverend Cole came up the ridge, not with sermons, but with stories. He'd sit beneath the spruce and speak of justice, of courage, of quiet redemption. And the people listened because now the truth had a place to root, just like the herbs in Sarah's garden. Some evenings when the light turned golden and the air smelled of wood smoke and thyme, neighbors from town would stop by, bringing pies, news, or just their presence. No longer curious, no longer wary, just grateful. On the porch of the cabin, once a place where silence clung like fog, there was laughter, the kind that came deep from the chest. Children played tag around the cedar trees, their shrieks of joy echoing against the mountain. Eli would sit in his chair, whittling another fox or sparrow, glancing up every now and then to meet Sarah's eyes across the porch. Nothing more needed saying. The valley had not forgotten the sorrow that once lived there, but it remembered too what had grown in its place. And that was the better story, the true one. The land remembers. So do they.